Thinking about starting a podcast, but worried about the legal stuff that comes along with it? Well, then stay tuned, because I'm going to tell you about 4 legal things that you need to know before you start a podcast. Hi everyone, I'm attorney Aiden Durham with 180 Law Co. in Colorado, and welcome back to All Up in Your Business. Podcasts are huge right now. I don't know about you guys, but to me it seems like everybody has a podcast, which is a great thing because podcasts can be available for anyone and anyone can make a podcast. So if you're thinking about starting a podcast soon, there are a few things that you want to keep in mind, and I'm going to tell you about what those are. But before we get into it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and check the description for links to additional information and resources. All right, so the first legal thing that you need to think about before you start a podcast is trademarks. The name of your podcast. Just like if we're starting a business, one of the most important things about a podcast is the name. This is what's gonna get people to notice it. We'll get people to click it and listen to your episodes is gonna be a name that people will want to be interested in and want to watch or listen to. And the name of a podcast is considered a trademark. So just like when we're starting a business, the first thing we want to do is make sure this name is available. Because what might happen if you don't do your due diligence, if you don't check to make sure the name's available, you launch your podcast, maybe it's super successful, everyone's listening to it, everyone's loving it, and then a little cease and desist letter comes a knock-in saying, hey, I've already been using this name for my podcast. It's my trademark. You need to cut it out. And now your popular podcast, you might have to go back to the drawing board and completely rebrand. That could affect your subscribers or your listeners, become a whole big mess. So of course, we want to jump on Google and on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're using, search other podcasts and the internet to see if someone's using the same name that you're thinking about using or something similar to it. Because we don't need to be focused just about identical names. Even if there's another podcast out there that has a kind of similar name, you still want to avoid using something that's too similar to an existing podcast. It's also a good idea to search the USPTO's records with TESS, their TESS, the Trademark Electronic Search System. You can search for pending or registered trademarks that again are either identical or similar to the name that you want to use for your podcast. But even if someone doesn't have a registered trademark, they could still have some trademark rights in that name. So outside of the USPTO, of course, making sure just there's nobody else already using a name similar to the name that you want to use for your podcast. Might also be a good idea to think about registering the name of your podcast. Once you've decided on a name, you know it's available, registering the podcast name with the USPTO is going to help make sure nobody else starts a podcast with that name or a similar name. Again, you have these rights without registration, but if you do find a podcast with the same name, having a registered trademark with the USPTO is going to make it a lot easier to get those podcasts removed. Platforms like iTunes and Spotify, they have a process for handling intellectual property issues. If you're able to submit proof that you have a registered trademark for a podcast name, that's going to make it a lot easier to get those platforms to take down that content. So number 1 legal issue we want to be aware of, trademarks. Number 2, copyrights. If you're going to be using music in the intro for your podcast or playing music in your podcast or photos for your podcast cover or the show notes, any music or photos that you might use in your podcast or in connection with your podcast, we want to make sure you've got the proper license to use it. It doesn't matter if you only use 3 seconds of a song, a second of a song. It doesn't matter if you're only using this photo in one instance. One instance of copyright infringement is one instance of copyright infringement. And there are no rules that say you are allowed to use a certain time limit of a song without copyright issues. You need a license, you need proper authorization to use music or photos in your podcast or in connection with your podcast. Now you might be thinking, Aiden, what about fair use? Can't I use some copyrighted materials under fair use without any issue? Yeah, kind of sometimes, but fair use is very tricky. We don't always know exactly what fair use means. I mean, we know what it means, but we don't know exactly all the time, this is fair use, this isn't fair use. So you might use a clip of music in your podcast thinking that it's fair use, but if the owner of that song doesn't think it's fair use, they can still try to take some action against you, get your podcast removed, or whatever other rights they might have. And it's only once that happens that you can say fair use, because fair use is a defense to copyright infringement. All right, so we've got trademarks, we've got copyrights, and now we've got contracts. The next thing you want to keep in mind when you're launching a podcast is some of the important contracts that you're going to want to have ready. A few of the primary ones that will apply to podcasters. Number one, if you've got a co-host, have some kind of co-host agreement or partnership agreement. This agreement should spell out, of course, how are we going to make money from this podcast? Who's making how much if we start generating profit from it? But more importantly, who owns this content? What happens if our co-hosts split ways or they don't get along anymore? Who owns the podcast content? Can one of them continue on producing the podcast? Can they keep using the podcast name? All of these issues should be spelled out in an agreement with any of your podcast co-hosts. And same goes for guests that you might have on your podcast. If you're going to have guests, other people coming in to appear on your podcast, we want to have a contract with them too. Now, these things don't need to be super detailed, doesn't need to be a 20-page contract. It can be a relatively simple document, but a few of the things that we want to make sure are addressed in these podcast guest agreements are, number one, our ability to use their name, photo, biographical information, pretty much however we want to market the podcast. This is going to ensure that later on, if we post something on social media talking about the episode with this guest and we use their photo in that post, it's going to ensure that that guest can't later say, I didn't give you permission to use this photo, or I didn't give you permission to market your podcast on this platform. A good agreement with your podcast guests is going to make sure that you can market and distribute and use your podcast however you want, and that in doing so, you're permitted to use their name, photo, likeness in connection with that podcast. It's also going to help make sure you retain ownership of that episode. In theory, a podcast guest can have some copyright interest in that episode because it's a creative work, it's eligible for copyright protection, and as a guest, I am contributing to its creation. I am kind of a co-author of this podcast, but that means they have some ownership in that episode, and typically we don't want that. So a guest agreement should spell out, I as the podcast creator or producer own the intellectual property rights and copyrights in the content that we create with you. And you as the guest have no interest in that. You don't have interest in continuing profit, whatever the case may be. Spell all that out in your guest agreement. And the last kind of contract we're going to want to make sure we have has to do with our advertisers or sponsors. So if you're one of the lucky podcasters who gets some advertising deal, you get to start actually making money and earning a profit from your podcast. You're going to be engaging with other brands, other companies to advertise or help promote their products or services. And in this deal, we definitely want to make sure we have a contract. So we know, of course, number one, how much are you making off of the deal? What are the circumstances surrounding payment of that income to you? And what is the sponsor or the advertising affiliate partner going to expect in exchange for that? I don't know, how many times do we have to mention the product or service in the podcast? Are there things that we can or can't say in there? Can we use this company's logo when we're promoting the podcast? All of these issues should be spelled out in that contract. And finally, the last legal issue that we need to keep in mind as podcasters has to do, again, with these sponsorships or advertising deals, making sure we give proper disclosures and disclaimers anytime we're promoting or advertising somebody else's business. Under the rules of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, we are required to disclose if we are receiving any money, any kind of benefit in exchange for talking about or advertising somebody else's products or services. So this means, of course, if we're getting paid for it, but also if we're just receiving something in exchange. So if a company's sending you their product for free and in exchange they want you to promote it on your podcast, that needs to be disclosed either in the podcast itself. A lot of times you hear, we want to thank our sponsors or our partners for this episode, or this episode is brought to you by our partners and our affiliates, or you can disclose it in your show notes or in your podcast notes, something like these are advertisements or these are our affiliate sponsors. One way or another, the important thing is that we're letting our listeners know that we're getting something in exchange for this advertisement. And please, don't make any false claims. Don't say that you love a product if you've never actually used it. Because just like with disclosures, the FTC also requires that any advertisements be truthful and not misleading. And if we're saying, this is the best, dog grooming brush I've ever used. Rocky's sitting right there and I have to give him a bath later, so I was thinking about dog grooming. But we can't say this is the best dog grooming brush I've ever used. If you've never actually used that dog grooming brush, if you've never even held it in your hands, that's not a truthful advertisement. You're blatantly lying to people. You can still tell them about the benefits of the dog grooming brush. You can read whatever copy the dog grooming brush wants you to read, but you shouldn't say that you've used a product or that you've had experience with a product or a service if you haven't actually done so. So of course, these things don't apply exactly the same to all podcasts. If you're not going to have a co-host, then you don't need to worry about a co-host agreement. If you're never going to have guests on your podcast, then you don't need to worry about a guest agreement. But these are things that you want to make sure you keep in mind as you're developing your concept for your podcast and as you start launching and putting it out there. So again, making sure your trademark for your podcast name is available for you and registering it if you want to be able to easily protect your podcast name. Making sure we're not infringing on anybody else's copyrights when we use music or photos in connection with our podcast. Making sure we have contracts in place with our co-hosts, guests, sponsorship partners, podcast producers, anyone who has their hands in the podcast pot. We want to have something in writing that describes that relationship. And finally, making sure we are abiding by any FTC disclosure rules or truthfulness in advertising rules when we're working with podcast sponsors or advertising partners. If you're launching a podcast or if you already have a podcast and are concerned about these legal issues, it's always best to consult with an experienced attorney who's licensed in your state for specific advice and assistance. That's all for this episode, folks. Drop a comment below, let me know what you think. And again, don't forget to check the description for links to additional information and resources. If you guys want, comment. If you guys want to know my favorite podcasts, I will include a list of those. I don't know if anybody cares. I get a lot of people who ask me, what are my favorite, legal podcasts or business podcasts? What do I listen to learn more about legal stuff or business stuff? Frankly, I don't. I listen to comedy podcasts and podcasts about health and stuff. I don't listen to anything that has to do with being a lawyer or business, really. Which some people find odd, but I think about that stuff all day long. I deal with legal and business issues. And so when I'm listening to a podcast, the last thing I want to do is keep thinking about work stuff. But I don't know, if you guys care, let me know in the comments and I'll let you guys know my favorite podcast. You might change your opinion about me after that. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham and I'll see you next time.